Okay, Blake, I saw some traffic on the subreddit this week, and some of our fans were pressing the button in the rat cage for more cocaine as hard as they could, saying, "We need another Tesla podcast this week. Please, please, please. Don't leave us hanging with all the drama."
What did the post say exactly?
It said, "Help, I'm trapped in this cage in a laboratory and I fear for my life. They do horrible things to me. But I have lots of cocaine. It's great. Rescue me, but not too quickly."
So it's time to produce more Tesla cocaine, I guess.
Yes, another giant bowl of sugar. So the last time we recorded one of these, I left off by saying there were a number of things that I was going to be looking for on the conference call that was on August 1st. And I wanted to start with that tonight. The first was working capital, which is essentially the difference between short-term, or it's the sum of your short-term liabilities against your cash position and your short-term account payables, or account receivables rather. So it's basically the difference in income and expenses on the short term. And this number has been getting worse and worse for Tesla over the last several quarters. At the end of the first quarter, it was negative $2.2 billion. I said that I expected it to increase, but not all the way to negative $3 billion. It increased by only $175 million. So it got worse by $175 million to about negative $2.4 billion of working capital. And what that really means is that Tesla needs about $2.4 billion of money in order to be even, in order to bring their account. I mean, you can think of this as you have a bunch of bills to pay and you get a paycheck. And when you look at the number of bills you have outstanding against the amount of cash you have on hand and the paycheck that's supposed to come in this Friday, the difference is you're missing $2.4 billion. So you need $2.4 billion extra. The components that changed that went into the working capital calculation, the ones that changed greatly were that the company burned through $430 million of cash, and they increased their accounts payable also by $430 million. Those are not related. They just happen to be about the same number. That means that they owe an additional $430 million to suppliers. And they drew another $100 million on short-term debt. So they have some of these short-term lines of credit that are basically analogous to what a consumer would have as a credit card. And they ran up the bill another $100 million. Now, in exchange for that, they added $800 million of inventory, which is a lot of these cars that they held back at the end of the quarter. So we knew that happened. They were holding those cars back so that they wouldn't exceed the 200,000 car delivery limit that starts phasing out one of the tax credits that buyers get. So
So is that phasing out coming next quarter?
the way it works is that they delivered their 200,000th car on the first day of the third quarter of 2018. And so that's when the phase out clock starts. But the actual reduction in the credit does not happen for 2 quarters.
Okay.
So the credit will initially cut in half up to $7,500 to just up to $3,750 tax credit for the buyer of a car beginning on January 1st, 2019. The second thing that I said that I would be watching was deposits as a percentage of cash on hand. And again, that's important because Tesla takes all these deposits and reservations as cash, and then eventually they make a product and sell it to a person. Now, the reason it can be dangerous, it's not on its face that dangerous, but it could be dangerous if people suddenly decide that they don't trust the solvency of the company. And they say, hey, I've got 1,000 or 5,000 or 50,000 or $250,000 of money that is in a non-protected, non-escrowed account with Tesla. And they go essentially making a run on the bank, pulling all that deposit money out. So again, cash on hand decreased by 430 million, deposits decreased by 43 million, but the ratio of deposits as a percentage of cash on hand, it increased from 37% at the end of Q1 to 42% at the end of Q2. So a 5% increase. So it just kind of increases the potential danger of that situation if it comes to that. It's also, some people would argue, not quite honest to say that these deposits should really count as cash. They should probably be subtracted from the cash when you do all these calculations of working capital and when you report it, because it is really cash that's reserved for something else, but it's not accounted that way.
Mm.
I also said that the quarterly loss I expected would be $5 or $6 or $700 million. I just threw out a giant range so then I could claim I was correct. It worked. It was $717 million for the quarter lost. And that calculates out to $330,000 an hour that they burned.
Nice.
Another thing that I didn't point out on the podcast, but something that people really need to watch if you're of the type who looks at these income statements and the balance sheets and everything on the reports, is the growth of the SG&A line item, the sales, general, and accounting. That grew by another 10% this quarter. And that's even with Tesla laying off 9% of its workforce partway through the quarter, and even with supposedly being able to realize efficiencies in their delivery center operations because they're delivering more cars now. Essentially, they're utilizing the delivery centers better. The number still grew 10%, and that's a really bad sign. Tesla absolutely has to get that number under control if they ever want to be profitable. But SG&A has been a continuously gaping wound for Tesla's balance sheet forever. So that brings us to the other part of the conference call, which there were a couple other things I wanted to point out. When they started taking questions, they took the two guys that Elon was rude to last time, and they let them ask the first two questions. And Elon gave a real nice apology to each one. And it struck me as kind of, if Elon makes good choices from now on, and he really puts on like the big boy CEO pants, and he deletes his Twitter account, and he gets right with the CEO gods, people will look back at that moment and they'll say, that's the moment when he turned it around. That's when he became a professional CEO, when he gave those apologies to those guys. And they really seemed like sincere apologies. And, the guys thanked him for the apologies and then asked their questions, and he tried to give good answers. And it was a good thing to see that maybe he's growing into the role, but he has to follow it up. It can't just be a one-off thing where the rest of the board finally managed to shame him hard enough into doing it. It really needs to be something that repeats from here on out.
I felt like the guys asking the questions he was like, I'm sorry, I was under a lot of pressure, and that was rude, and I'm sorry for that. And it seemed like they were sort of like, okay. And then they asked their questions. Like, I didn't expect to get apologized to on this conference call. I'm not sure what to do with that.
I think they probably did expect it, because they probably knew they had the first and second question of the call.
Okay.
If nothing else, they may have thought, well, maybe that's the apology. He'll just give us the first and second brush off this call. A lot of the rest of the call, though, was just wasted. I mean, they brought in a bunch of guys from their self-driving team, and they had them talk. And that's something I asked Blake about, because they went on and on about this like AI chip that they've developed. And they say that, well, one, they admitted that the hardware they've been putting in cars for almost 2 years now will in fact not be capable of full self-driving, and that they'll have to trade out this new chip for the old hardware. But they say it's just plug and play. You don't have to do any like wiring changes or anything. You'll just literally swap it out. But again, that's a giant cost that they'll have for every car that becomes self-driving. And I kind of glazed over on that part because I don't understand that stuff. Like, I can kind of understand some self-driving stuff, but when it gets into like neural networks, I don't know about that. And then it gets into like chips, and they're like, there's this type of calculation that we're doing over and over, and then we're going to locate, like, I guess they said something like partial processors really close to memory so they could talk back and forth really fast or something like that. And so what did you think about that, Blake? Because I just don't have the expertise to have evaluated any of that. I didn't know if I was getting smoke blown up my ass, or like, do they really have something here that's interesting? What do you think?
No, I don't think it's particularly interesting. I feel like they didn't admit that they couldn't do self driving before. What part of what they said do you think was that admission?
Well, in October of 2016, they said that from here on out, every car we build will have all the hardware required for full self-driving. And then on this call, they said, this is the new chip that will be the full self-driving, computer. And it will plug into where the current hardware is and replace it.
Yeah, okay. I feel like there's some way that you can weasel out of that. I'm not sure. Maybe something like, oh, it had full self-driving on highways with user attention, but this one will get you to level 5 or something like that. I don't know. It seems like you can weasel out of it. But yeah, so they brought, I think his name's Andre Carpathy. I don't remember how you say it. He said it on the call, but I don't remember. That guy is a super awesome machine learning guy. He's like done a whole bunch of work that a lot of other machine learning people have learned from. So he's really impressive. But he was just sort of like, we're working on it. I feel like he didn't really say anything particularly interesting, but I had forgotten that he went to Tesla, and I was like, oh man, it's that guy when he was on the call. I have a lot of respect for him. Then the hardware guy talked, and he was like, yeah, we're working on what this essentially is like a TPU, which is the TensorFlow processing unit that Google is working on. And the problem they identified on the call is a real problem. There's like a couple of different ways that you can do this sort of processing. You can use a CPU, a GPU, or some more specialized hardware like a TPU. If you do this on a CPU, you run into this problem where the computation they talked about where you were glazing over was matrix multiplies. It's not really that complicated. It is actually just multiplying a matrix. And when you try to multiply a matrix, you run into this problem where you have to do these memory accesses and you need to go through like each row one at a time and each column one at a time. And so you have to access all of this memory. The matrix is really big, and it will cause problems with flushing out the cache in your CPU because the cache isn't either large enough to hold it, or it's like too large and you're not using it exactly correctly. And so you load two values into memory, you multiply them, and then you go write them out somewhere else. And you do this a bunch of times, and you add all those values together. And then like that's a matrix multiply. And so doing one value at a time is really slow in CPU. So people really quickly turn to using GPUs to do this, which is a graphics processing unit. But in this case, they're really using it as like just sort of a general purpose parallel processing unit. GPUs are designed to do a whole bunch of very simple things all at the same time, because that's the nature of trying to draw graphics to a screen. Something you might do is transform the vertices on a polygon, but a million times per frame. Like a common thing is you'll have a million points in a frame in a regular computer game. And this thing can do tons and tons of those at once. They'll have mini processors. They're co-located with the RAM. And so they can like do all this at once. So similarly, you can do your matrix multiplies on that, and it speeds it up a huge amount. But you do run into these problems where it's like not exactly specialized hardware meant just for doing matrix multiplies. It can do other things like make pretty graphics. So Google and a few other companies started trying to build customized hardware that's just really good at doing matrix multiplies. So Google has their TPU, and Tesla has their whatever this thing is that's probably not as good, but they're pretending like it's super world-class hardware, but then it's going to go into a whole bunch of cars. Like, really, if it was going to be the most advanced chip in the world, it'd be going into a data center somewhere. You wouldn't build like a ruggedized one for going in a car. So it's not going to be the most advanced, but whatever. You don't have the most advanced processor in your phone either, but if your phone is fast, it's fast. So it's kind of, I guess, a good sign that they're building this customized hardware. I'm not sure I see the need for it. Like, why not just throw more GPUs at it? Like, it's way cheaper to have a couple of GPUs doing a job than to build a custom processor to do the job. Like, the R&D that goes into making a custom processor is just crazy unless you have some kind of industrial espionage going on. And I mean, you can just hire a bunch of guys from Google or whatever who worked on the TPU, and then it's not exactly industrial espionage, right? And they're just like, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did this thing? That's exactly like what I did at a previous company of mine. But I don't know if that's what they're doing. So anyway, they're working on this processor, and then they got into the slightly more technical description where they're like, NVIDIA's hardware can do 200 frames a second, but this is able to do over 2,000 frames a second. So that's pretty pointless. Like, who cares if you're doing 200 frames a second in the first place? The cameras that they're using are likely not 200 frame per second cameras. They do make those. They make cameras that go up to really high frame rates. But for navigating on a road, realistically, you need something like 10 frames per second, something like that, because that's still faster than human reaction time. And so it's not doing you a whole lot more good to get more frames. And in particular, people aren't developing algorithms that can really take advantage of those. So 2000 sounds nice. It's a very impressive number, but the car is not going to go from 200 to 2000 and then drive 10 times better. It's going to drive the same.
Could you, okay, because that's what I was about to ask. Like, could you use that extra processing overhead that you have that you don't need just for basic driving to do all kinds of like extra redundancy checks and like just make up a whole bunch of extra algorithm that improves safety somehow and uses up a greater percentage of that processor? Would there be an advantage there?
I don't know. This is a place where I guess it would have helped if I had been trying to build self-driving cars myself. But in general, what I think they're talking about when they're saying 200 frames or whatever is they're talking about an algorithm that takes all of the pixels of the image and then it runs a neural network over all of the pixels and then it tries to make a prediction about something in the image, which is usually going to be where are the lane markers and where are other cars that I could collide with. And so it's trying to essentially do image segmentation, which is take all of the pieces of the scene and figure out what entities they belong to, if any. So we want to say this is the road, this is cars, this is people, this is other crap we don't care about. And you can't really, like, if you segment the scene correctly and you segment it at 10 frames per second, you can make all of the right decisions in terms of how to drive. Like, you compute the steering and the gas and the brake, and you say, stay away from all the stuff. And so if you can compute it a whole lot faster, you can't really get any safer, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they figured something out. You could have some kind of AI that people haven't really talked about yet, like something that's better able to plan or something like that. But then you, again, wouldn't care about frames per second. You don't care about just the raw horsepower. It's really going to take an algorithmic breakthrough. So, and since they're not talking about any kind of algorithmic improvement, I'm guessing they don't have any. I think they're just doing standard image recognition stuff. So going at 2000 frames per second just sounds like a really pointless endeavor. It sounds like a number that someone told Elon as like a benchmark, like, hey, this is so much faster. And he was like, yeah, okay, I'm going to quote that number to the press. And then he did, but it doesn't really mean anything in the context of machine learning.
So there's an alternate theory for why they wrangled the self-driving team into the conference call. And that is they're making this huge push to show profit and to show positive free cash flow in Q3 and Q4. Now, one item that they have that they've been selling for a long time is full self-driving. You've been able to actually pay, I believe it's $3,000 and buy full self-driving on your Tesla. Now, obviously it doesn't work yet, but you've been allowed to buy that option for like 2 years now. And some small percentage of people have. I don't really know what the percentage is. I'm not sure that anyone knows. I know that I've seen one particular author I follow who goes and visits a Tesla dealership near him, and he visits it like twice a week and looks at all the window stickers on the cars that are coming through that dealership. And he sees that the uptake of full self-driving is pretty low, which you would expect it to be since it's not ready yet. You're paying in advance for this thing that they promised to deliver. But nonetheless, Tesla has gathered up, I don't know, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars in full self-driving reservations or down payments, or they've paid for it but haven't delivered it. Well, on the income statement, it doesn't go on the income statement as part of the revenue from the car because they haven't delivered that part of the car yet. And so it's off on a different part of the accounting. And if they get to a point where they declare we are releasing full self-driving capabilities, which they have said they are going to begin doing. They are going to begin increasing the full self-driving capabilities. Now, not complete full self-driving. Then they can recognize as revenue some of those down payments, some of those prepayments for full self-driving. They can recognize some percentage of it as revenue in the quarter that they deliver those capabilities. And so they can say something like, and they get to just arbitrarily make this up. They can say like, we improved the lane keeping and we made it so good and so safe that it's really level 5 lane keeping. Now it's just lane keeping, but it's full self-driving lane keeping. And then they'll say, I think we should get to recognize 15% of all that money that people have paid for full self-driving, the ones who have chosen to pay for it, as revenue. And when they do that, they get to recognize it in the current quarter. And hey, it's got a gross margin of 100%. And so it's a very, very effective tool in their quest to get towards this kind of one-off profitability in Q3 and Q4. Because they have this huge mountain of money sitting over there that they just haven't been allowed to recognize as revenue yet. And so that's what I thought when they came on the conference call and they were like, yeah, we dragged in these autonomous driving guys. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, everybody rates Tesla like dead last in autonomous driving. Like they're behind tiny companies that like you've never heard of. And when you see the analysts who follow self-driving really hard and they're like, here's where we think everybody is, and they show this two-dimensional plot of these two different factors they measure, like there's all these companies on there that I don't even recognize, and they're all ahead of Tesla. And Tesla is like furthest away from that like level 5 point up in the top right corner. And so for those people to be brought onto the call and for them to be given like 30 minutes of the call to just jabber about like, here's what I'm doing day to day in the self-driving group, either on the hardware or the software. Like that's immediately what I gravitated to as the explanation is they're just kind of buttering it up where they can be like, now we're going to recognize some of this full self-driving revenue and it's going to help push us into profitability for Q3 and Q4.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it provides a lot of information to the investors. Like we made faster hardware and we're really excited about the work we're doing on machine learning. And it's like, okay, how does this affect buying or selling Tesla stock? And it was sort of unclear.
Yeah. Yeah. So there were some other statements that were made on the call that I wanted to touch on briefly. Elon claimed that the amount of capex they would need to go from 5,000 Model 3s a week to 10,000 was a, quote, tiny fraction of the amount that they needed to go from 0 to 5,000. And this kind of circles back to something we talked about last time, which was, are they really trying for 10,000 per week? Because originally they said 5,000, and then later on they started talking about 10,000. And at times they've gone back and forth, and at times they've said we're not going to spend any capex to go towards 10,000 until we're firmly at 5,000 at a consistent rate. I was just highly skeptical on it'll be a tiny fraction of the amount of capex. I don't think that's true at all. And even if it is, there was a study done by some investment group that specializes in the auto industry, and their conclusion was that the amount of capex that Tesla spent on a basis of cars per time production capacity of the Model 3 assembly line was 4 times as high as the industry standard. So hopefully they can reduce it from that, but I don't think they're going to get to a tiny fraction. I thought that was silly. An interesting thing they said was that half of all Model 3s that are being ordered are all-wheel drive, which is a good thing for Tesla because they just throw an extra drive motor in there. They charge, I think, $4,000 is the current price of adding all-wheel drive to the car, and that's a really high margin upgrade to the car. They said that they thought they could build the Chinese factory in Shanghai with a 250,000 car per year capacity for only $2 billion. And that's not going to happen. The kind of common sense in the auto industry on what it takes to build an automotive factory about that capacity is $3 to $5 billion. And then you have to put the Tesla factor on there, where again, they spent 4x the amount of capex on the Model 3 line. They're wildly inefficient in all of their capex and all of their production. And now they're claiming that they're going to beat the industry standard by at least 33%. All of a sudden, they're going to go from lagging the entire industry to beating it by 33%. And then Elon went off on one of these diatribes that he does. And this is where like Elon has learned some like mundane engineering fact and he thinks it's just the coolest thing ever. So he talks about it on the conference call, or he makes some comment about engineering or science that's supposed to sound really smart. And Tesla also does this in their marketing materials. One that I saw many years ago was when they introduced the Gigafactory and they gave the first like artist drawings of what it would look like and everything. The statement that was next to the drawing had this nonsense in it about we went back to the first principles of physics to design this factory. And it's like bullshit. No, you didn't. Like, and to people who are not technically oriented, who are not maybe educated as engineers or scientists, or are not enthusiastic about it and have taught themselves a lot about it, you hear something about that and you hear the words first principles of physics. And it's like, wow, I don't even know what that means. It must be really smart. And if you are an engineer or a scientist, you hear that and you just kind of roll your eyes and you're just like, oh God, that's stupid. And so he had a great moment like this on this conference call. He said that he was talking about the general assembly for the assembly line they built inside of the tent. And he said that there was a 1% grade on the assembly line. And like he goes on for like 3 or 4 sentences talking about how they harnessed gravity with this 1% grade to help like make the work easier and like speed up the assembly line. And like he goes on, not like it's a dumb joke. I mean, if I were making that as a dumb joke, it would be one line and then I would see if the audience reacted at all, But he goes on about how like this 1% grade helps move the cars. And I remember I was listening to this conference call. Blake was listening to it. We were in Blake's Discord channel listening with some other folks too. And like, I just opened the calculator on my laptop and I was like, sine of 1 degree. And it's like, it's 0.017. And so that means that like, if you have a 1 degree slope, you get 1.7% of a G in horizontal force, helping pull your line along faster. And it's like, this is the kind of bullshit where it's like, when you have that background and you understand like, what is the calculation I need to do real fast to like figure out exactly how much force that helps with. And then you go do it and you're like, man, that's stupid. But if you're maybe just a financial guy, or if you're none of these types of people, then hey, you think, oh yeah, he put the assembly line at a slope so that gravity would help move the car faster. I wonder if those idiots at Toyota ever thought of that.
Bunch of idiots. It reminds me of when Nissan initially started selling the GTR, and one of their selling points was the tires are filled with nitrogen because it's lighter.
Ugh.
And it's like, you know what else is filled with nitrogen? My tires and everyone's tires, because about 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen. And so what's left? Oh no, you got a bunch of oxygen in there. It's almost as light and it doesn't matter. And it sounds cool. Like, wow, you're filling the tires with a chemical. There must be some good reason for it. And they're like, yeah, it's lighter. And it's like, wow. But then when you think about what's the atmosphere made of, it's a lot less impressive.
Yeah. And this is where a lot of like Elon's mystique comes from. It's he makes statements like this and he's very talented at doing it, like throwing out this little sciencey sounding thing that most people will totally not understand and just think they don't understand it because Elon's so smart. And I don't know, it's irritating to me because some of them, at least, I see right through, and I'm just sitting there rolling my eyes at how dumb it is. Because I imagine myself like being in a meeting at work with other engineers who some of whom are better engineers than I am, some of whom are more experienced than I am. And I can imagine if I said, yeah, let's put the assembly line on a 1% grade so that gravity helps us move it faster. And I could just imagine like one of the guys like leaning back as he turns one degree or 1%, or I forget. He said it was a 1 degree grade, not a 1%. But turning that into the radian equivalent and then using the small angle approximation and like just telling me how dumb that was. I wouldn't dare try that stuff like at work around engineers. But Elon gets away with it, and it increases his like street cred with people who don't grab it really quickly and realize kind of the nonsensical nature of it.
Well, it's also really similar to what Steve Jobs did, and he was really famous for his reality distortion field. And one of the things that he did really well is he would throw out engineering numbers, but in a political context. Like, I feel like the thing that Steve Jobs was really master at was he was a politician, and he would get up and give a political speech about a technical product. And most people were not prepared to try and see through political bullshit in that context. They weren't thinking, I'm listening to a State of the Union address, but about a phone. They were instead thinking like, oh, I'm seeing a brochure with bullet points about the phone. And so, of course, they're going to compare it to other phones in reasonable ways with numbers that make sense. But he would say something like, oh, this phone has 10,000 new APIs. And then all the engineers would immediately struggle and be like, what are APIs? Like, what does it even mean to count them? Like, because what an API is, what it stands for is application programming interface. And so if you add another function to an API, it's still an API. If you add 10,000 functions to it, you have one API with 10,000 functions. And so if you say, I have 10,000 APIs, it's like, do you have some kind of super muddled product that makes no sense and there's 10,000 buttons on it? And it's like, no, he was just counting something that no one else counts. And he says 10,000 APIs. And the press is like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of APIs. I've never heard of something with that many APIs. Because you never heard of anything with 2 APIs. It doesn't even make sense, much less 10,000. And so he would say these things and nobody was using like a critical ear on them. And if the president gets up and says something like, oh, we've reduced poverty by 10,000%, everybody's like, okay, what does he really mean? What is it? Is that even a real number? And everyone goes and checks it. But when Jobs or Musk would get up and say something like this, everyone's just like, oh, well, that must be really good.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to cover that about the conference call since we left off there last time. And then I wanted to talk about all the stuff that happened this week. And, it was so uneventful until Tuesday. This news came out Tuesday that the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund had taken somewhere between a 3 but less than 5% stake in Tesla, meaning that they had just bought shares on the open market over time. If they get to a 5% stake, they have to make reports to the US government. And so I believe it was either Tencent or SoftBank last year took a similar stake in Tesla that was initially 5%. And so like they made one report, and then Tesla does a lot of its compensation by giving out new stock. So they eventually diluted them enough that they no longer had 5% and they don't have to report anymore. But this news came out early on Tuesday, which was August 7th. So the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund is this big fund that they have where they're trying to get away from oil revenue. And they're trying to diversify their economy and diversify their income by investing in all kinds of stuff. So I think a year ago, they took a big stake in Uber, I believe a 5% stake. But they had spent somewhere between about $2 and $3 billion buying the stake in Tesla on the open market. Now, something weird that I saw was some people were like, oh yeah, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, had come to America earlier this year, back in April. And he had like toured America for like 2 weeks or something, like meeting with all these politicians and businessmen and celebrities and all these people. And he was supposed to meet with Elon Musk. And then afterwards, like Elon said, yeah, we never met. And I don't really know if like he stood up Elon or if like they just couldn't get their schedules together or what, but they didn't actually meet. And so there was all this like, I don't want to say conspiracy, but there was all this like talk initially of, hey, I bet this came out of that thing. And people weren't remembering that they didn't actually meet. The news of Saudi Arabia taking a stake in the company, though, sent the stock up about 4% that morning. And if that wasn't enough, then a few hours later, Elon makes this tweet that starts the entire storm of the next week. And he says, am considering taking Tesla private at $420, funding secured. Meaning he would have a buyout plan where every share outstanding of the company would be bought up for $420 each. And then it would become a private company, no longer listed on a stock exchange. And he said, funding secured. Like, it's a done deal. We've got the money lined up to do it. He also said that he himself would not be selling his stock and that current investors could stay if they wanted. And that's a weird thing to claim because there's certain rules on how many investors you can have in private companies. And it's not entirely clear how, if you're some guy who owns like 20 shares of Tesla, like how exactly you'd be allowed to stay if the company goes private. So, needless to say, when he says, I've secured funding to take the company private at $420 a share, well, at the time, the stock was trading at something like $350 a share, somewhere around there. You should expect that the stock should jump a lot because if you're just sitting there and you say, someone's going to buy this thing for $420, but I can purchase it now for $350, I can make a $70 difference. And so you expect the stock to jump up a bunch. What was interesting is the market didn't really take him seriously. And so if it had been the kind of situation where maybe it was a different company and it was a small company, there were bigger companies in the same industry, and you knew it was a good buyout target, and this happened, the market would probably have taken that very seriously and within a matter of minutes bid the price of the stock all the way to whatever the offer price for the buyout was. But this didn't happen. It went up like another $20 or so, I want to say, to like $370 or $380, somewhere around there. So you could tell that the market was not, they thought there was a decent chance that this was not for real. And initially, people were saying things like, well, it's a fake Twitter account, or his Twitter account got hacked, or he's high and drunk, or it's a joke. There were all these theories, and everything was moving so fast. I remember talking to someone again on Blake's Discord channel, and it was just like, I've got no idea what's going on because the amount of useful information that was coming through that morning was so low. Eventually, trading of the stock was halted, awaiting Tesla making a statement and a filing with the SEC. Part of the reason, though, that you could expect the market would not take this seriously is at the current number of shares outstanding and $420 per share, it would make this about a $70 billion deal to take the company private, which would be far and away the largest buyout of a company ever. And again, Tesla is not, right now at least, a profitable company. So the skepticism was very well received. GM currently has a market cap of about $50 billion, and Ford has a market cap of about $40 billion. And yet Tesla is proposing that it should be the target of the largest buyout in history at over $70 billion. And so that's why there was so much skepticism. People in the financial press started contacting their sources within investment banks and brokerages and all over the financial world, looking for anybody who had inside knowledge. Because, they're looking to break a story. They're looking to figure out, who is the person who's actually providing this funding that Elon said is secured. And on Tuesday, they could not find anybody. And you have to ask yourself, these are deals that take hundreds of people, bankers and lawyers. It takes months to put these deals together. You're not going to do a $70 billion buyout with a single buyer. It's going to take a lot of buyers to get together that kind of money. And the skepticism continued to mount over the day as nobody could find anyone who would go even anonymously off record and say, yeah, this is real. Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or somebody is involved with it. Nobody would come on and say that. So the day goes on. Sometimes in the afternoon, Elon sends a letter to the employees of Tesla, basically reiterating, yeah, I'm thinking about taking the company private, and it would get rid of all these distractions and everything. But he says that his stake will remain. He'll still be about 20% owner of the company. So Wednesday comes along, and some board members say, man, we've got to cover our asses now, because Elon has thrown out this tweet saying funding is secured, and nobody can find anyone who will actually confirm that there is any real funding to this. And I mean, that's a clear-cut case of fraud if it's true that there's no funding. And he did say funding secured on Tuesday. So on Wednesday, some board members release a statement. It's 3 sentences long. And basically it says that Elon talked to them in the last week about wanting to go private. And so it's like, well, in the last week, I mean, these things take months to put together. And the board says, well, he talked to us about it in the last week. And it was this very, very tepid statement. Like, we're going to say something. We're going to establish that maybe we know a little, but we sure don't want to establish that we know too much. And we're just going to say this.
What's the point of doing that?
The answer to that question depends on what you think is really going on here. If you ultimately think that there is no funding and that this tweet was a lie, then the board needs to start covering its butt and not get caught up in this. They need to separate themselves from Elon. And they can do that by saying, he talked to us about wanting to go private last week, which kind of in a way says, yeah, he's full of it. He talked to us about wanting to last week. He never talked to us about securing funding, about the exact plan, about underwriters, about who they were, or anything. And so they're trying to get on the record distancing themselves from the event, saying basically, we only found out last week. We don't know what's going on either. Also, SoftBank came out and said, it's not us. We think Tesla's highly overvalued. When people talk about like a white knight coming to Tesla's rescue, they always like to talk about SoftBank, Tencent, the Saudi Arabian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and just some generic faceless group of Chinese. The Chinese will save them. So SoftBank got on record Wednesday morning saying, no, we think they're overvalued. We don't want to buy them. And the same day, the SEC started asking questions. They said, we're going to open an investigation and start talking to Elon and other board members and figure out who knew what when, and is this funding secured really real? But at the end of Wednesday, we still didn't have any idea who is funding this. So Thursday rolls around and Saudi Arabia and Fidelity both say they were blindsided by this. They had no idea what was going on. So you've now knocked out Saudi Arabia. And Fidelity has always been a big underwriter of stock issuances and debt issuances of Tesla anyway. They've been a strong financial partner of Tesla. So for them to also come out and say, hey, we were blindsided on Tuesday. We had no idea this was going on. It makes it look worse. We're still looking for somebody who will actually get on the record or even anonymously just say the company I work for is doing this, and still nobody is doing it. So also on Thursday, the SEC enlarges their probe into Tesla. I like that wording. They also said that the San Francisco field office of the SEC was already investigating other statements that Tesla had made in the past about production capacity and things like that to see if they thought those rose to the level of fraud. And the board of directors again made a statement and said, look, we're planning to meet next week to work out a process to explore going private. And so again, their wording is, we're trying to distance ourselves from that statement back on Tuesday that funding is secured. We're just saying that next week, we're going to have a meeting to work out a process to explore it. And so it appears to me, and if you have an alternate theory, you should tell me, but it appears like they're trying to distance themselves from that earlier funding secured statement.
I don't have an alternative hypothesis. Something I've wondered about, this is not quite related, is say Tesla is able to do a buyback at 420 per share and the stock is trading, say it's trading at the current price. Doesn't that mean that the price could go up like arbitrarily high because Tesla needs to buy all the shares? I don't understand, because I'm sure you're familiar with like the short squeeze concept where it's like your losses are unlimited on a short, and in fact they can be very high because at the point where you're trying to buy shares to cover your short position, they can go up really, really high if people know that you're doing that, because they're like, oh, I'll sell it to you for 10x its value, and you have to buy it because otherwise you've essentially reneged on your agreement. And so like if Tesla declares we're going to buy all the shares, is there something written into like the contract of being a shareholder with them where it's like you have to turn the share over, or what?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you're saying what is the force that forces you to sell it at 420 and not hold out and say I want $10,000?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what happens is the shareholders will vote, and you are required to obey what the majority of shareholders want.
Oh,
And so
okay.
that's how they force this. Yeah.
Okay.
And so especially in the case of Tesla, I mean, Elon owns 20%. We should assume though for this that he would recuse himself from this vote. He probably would. He normally recuses himself from like important votes that the company that like the shareholders do. So the institutional ownership though makes up another 60%. And a lot of them are going to look at it and they're going to be like, hey, all these shares I bought, anywhere between like $17 at IPO and I don't know, $300, I can get up to $420 for each of them. Of course, I'm voting for this. And a lot of those institutional holders are bound by rules that would force them to sell anyway if the company goes private. And so they would likely vote and sell and take their giant profits.
Okay.
Then we came around to Friday, this past Friday, August 10th, and the board said that it still didn't know who Elon had secured funding with. And
That's a good sign.
by Friday, it took all the way from Tuesday to Friday for the first class action lawsuit to be filed against Tesla and Elon as defendants for stock manipulation and fraud, based on the tweet on Tuesday saying funding secured.
Something I find amusing about this is how he wants to take the company private to avoid distractions. And now, because he said that, immediately there's going to be very distracting lawsuits and possible SEC investigations.
Yeah, so the rest of the notes that I prepared for this are just a giant list of like pros and cons of doing this. And I think that segues us into there very well. So, there's a lot of issues with going private for Tesla. The first that I just touched on a minute ago was not all investors can hold ownership in private companies. And so there are people who say, just by virtue of what brokerage you use, what online brokerage account you have, you may not be able to own it. And so if the majority of the shareholders were to vote to go private, your shares would just be liquidated and you would be paid for them. There are a lot of mutual funds and index funds that could no longer hold Tesla because they would either be removed from the index because they're now private, or in the case of mutual funds, the mutual fund may have rules that prohibits them from owning private companies. So they would also have to liquidate. Now, Elon has said during the week that, hey, if you want to stay on with us, you can. And that kind of seems like a clue that he's not really looking to get the whole company bought out. He's looking to only have part of it bought out. And, of course, another clue is when he said he would retain his stake. So if you start trying to finance this buyout and you immediately say, well, hey, Elon's going to retain his 20% stake, that's what, $14 billion that you don't have to come up with. He's just going to retain his stake and it'll now be a private company. Essentially, you only need to buy out enough people to just convert it to a private company. And there's a lot of argument over how much that will cost. I'll get into in a minute. Another problem with taking the company private is that a lot of the debt and liabilities that the company has come due on a change of ownership. So if the company has a substantial change of ownership where this white knight rides in and rescues the company, for instance, the 2025 bonds that Tesla issued last year, the $1.8 billion of bonds, they come due at 101% of face value immediately. And so those bondholders get paid, and they get paid a slight premium to the face value. They lose all the future cash flows of interest payments, but they have to be paid immediately. And so if this buyout is done in certain ways, there would be a lot of those kind of statements triggered in various debt and liabilities of the company. And the result of that is that they would need considerably more capital to buy it out to pay off those debts immediately. Some estimates say that they would need another $20 billion that they would have to pay off immediately. Another weird thing about this is that these kind of deals typically happen at a discount to the current price when you have a company that's financially weak like Tesla. They don't happen at huge 15 or 20% premiums, which is really bizarre. Who would pay a 20% premium for Tesla today? I know there are people out there who say, well, Tesla's going to be worth $1,000 a share or $10,000 a share or something. Well, will you pay 420 today? Are you spending every spare dollar you have to buy Tesla stock today at what, 360 or something? Why would people pay this huge extra amount when they could do what the Saudis did earlier this week and just quietly buy a lot of shares on the open market and keep accumulating at a cheaper price even? Another problem is Elon explained in his letter to his employees that investors who stayed with the company would be able to sell or buy stock, or I'm not sure even what the unit would be called, if it would even be called stock anymore, but they'd be able to sell or buy twice a year. So only 2 times a year do you have any liquidity, which is very disconcerting for most investments you have. You prefer to have some liquidity. We make very few investments in life that have such bad liquidity as that. Even a house I can sell in less than 6 months.
Yeah, that's true.
Another problem is that if they go private, there's a lot less transparency into the financials, and there's a lot less accountability for the board and for Elon specifically. And both of those things are really bad for Tesla shareholders. And I know that a lot of Tesla shareholders have a lot of faith in Elon Musk and don't care about the financials, but you shouldn't give up that control that you have, what tiny bit that you may have, to at least see the financial statements. You would be giving that up if it goes private. And if the buyer was a foreign entity, it would have to clear the hurdles of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So that could be a significant problem where suddenly we're looking at selling a $70 billion car company, American car company, to a foreign entity. So the government would have to approve it essentially. And I don't think this administration would be very kind to that. Some of the benefits of this buyout, though, is that for the conceivable future, all the talk of Tesla will be the buyout. Like, they released a 10Q statement and a quarterly report, and they had a conference call last week, and already nobody is talking about that. Like, the normal forensic accounting articles that I would expect to be reading this week, they're nowhere to be found because everybody's talking about this buyout offer and this tweet that funding is secured. And it's completely diverted the normal talk of Tesla's terrible financials towards this event instead, which is a good thing for Tesla if they're looking to raise money or maybe legitimately go private or something like that. It gets a lot of the talk in the media away from how bad the financials are at the company.
Do you think maybe this was plan B if they couldn't come up with a sham product for everyone to talk about? Like, Tesla's going to start making an electric rocket, and they're like, no, we're not ready with the CG video pretending like that's going to happen yet.
They had a new sham product just like a week ago. They said they were going to start making tiny cars.
What? I don't remember hearing about that.
Yeah, it got no traction.
Oh, okay.
But going forward, all we're going to be talking about is the buyout now, instead of dwelling on the financials for the next couple weeks as people tease out the important numbers from the financial statements. Tesla claims that one of the benefits of this for them would be that going forward, there's no more quarterly thinking at the company where, they make these big giant rushes the last week of the quarter to hammer in as many screws as possible and throw a bunch of cars out of the factory. And to that I say, well, Ford and GM and Toyota don't have those problems. I work for a company that manufactures a product and we don't have that problem. Maybe you could just stop doing that. And the only reason that Tesla's been doing these insane end of quarter things is because Elon gets on Twitter and he says, by the end of Q4 2017, we're going to be making 5,000 Model 3s per week. And so he set that expectation as an end of a quarter goal. And then he moved it to the end of Q2. Like, he's the one setting those. And then he's complaining that the company is being held accountable to them and that they feel pressured to have this quarterly type of thinking because of it. So just stop that. I mean, they could do that now without going private.
Maybe he's just one of those people who's like, I can't have snacks in the house because I'll eat them. And you're like, we'll just stop eating them. And he's like, no, I have to get the snacks out of my house.
Yeah, I deal with that by just not buying them. If I buy them, I'm fucked. But just don't buy them. That's what I do.
But maybe you just have to take the company private so that you stop setting quarterly goals and then forcing them on all your employees. Because you just can't stop yourself otherwise.
Ultimately, though, like I said earlier, the market seems unconvinced.
Maybe he has a quarterly target jar on his desk and he has to put a share of stock into it every time he tweets out a quarterly target. And he's like, I just can't stop myself. It's full of shares.
The share jar. The market seems pretty unconvinced that this is going to happen right now, based on the information that's known right now. And again, we're recording this on Sunday, August 12th. The price of the stock slid a lot over the rest of the week. It jumped up big on Tuesday when it was announced, but it gave back those earnings over the rest of the week. So, it's nowhere near $420. And short of some real big revelations that seem to have still not come out over this weekend, it doesn't seem that it's just going to spike up to 420 on the market suddenly believing that this deal is going to happen. How much would it cost, though? Again, I've seen estimates all over the place. It revolves around how many shares do we really need to buy out to make this happen? What kind of buyout do we do? I think a lot of people are familiar with leveraged buyouts because those have been kind of the hot thing for the last 20 years now. You probably could not do a leveraged buyout on Tesla because it already has so much debt and it has no cash flow. So it would have to be some other type of buyout. I've seen estimates of the amount ranging from $20 to $70 billion, as in you may get by with about a little over 20% of the shares needing to be purchased to take the company private, all the way up to all of them have to be purchased, which I think has already been ruled out because Elon says he plans to keep his 20%. So I don't know why people are predicting that high number. Going back to the cost to roll over the debt that comes due immediately, I've seen estimates on that from $10 to $20 billion. And something I really haven't seen people talk about was, let's say that the white knight rides to the rescue and saves Tesla and takes it private. You also need to inject a ton of cash into the company for CapEx. It needs money to spend. It has to build factories for the Y and the Semi and the Roadster and the pickup and the mini car and all these other things. I say mini car facetiously. I don't take that seriously. But it needs it needs seriously like another $6 to $10 billion for capex for a couple of new factories for those products. And I haven't seen anybody talk about that. So in sum, if you add those three items up, it ranges somewhere from 36 billion to 100 billion dollars would be the size of this deal. And even at 36 billion dollars, it would be in the top 5 biggest buyout deals ever.
There's not a lot of entities who have decision making power over $36 billion.
Very few, except the Chinese. I'm skeptical. I'm not sure what to think about this because I would hate to think that Elon actually just made this up and it's all bullshit. Because it's like he shouldn't do that. Like it's a really stupid thing to do. You know, it's very obviously fraud, and it's really just a dumb thing to do. And so I keep wanting to believe that there's some explanation in here that like they're just slow playing this and like it's going to come out that hey, yeah, we really do have the money lined up. We just decided to troll the entire world for a week. But it appears more and more as more days go on that like there is not funding secured and that it's not a real deal, that there was some other reason for making the claim. And especially as the board of directors has released these statements that appear to be distancing themselves from Elon. So I don't know what to think about it. It seems so stupid and wasteful if it is a fraudulent statement. But the evidence that we need to believe that it's real is not developing. And you would have expected by now, we're 5 days later, something should have developed.
So what happens if it is fraud?
The SEC would have to decide if they think it's worth prosecuting. The SEC has been pretty historically useless. I mean, Bernie Madoff scammed people out of something like $9 billion, and people were telling the SEC for decades that Bernie was a crook. And I mean, people were literally like doing their own forensic analysis and going to the SEC with the results and saying, look, this guy has to be a crook. And then the SEC was just like, whatever, and let him go on for another 10 years. So I don't have a lot of faith in the SEC. At the very least, there will be more shareholder lawsuits and just more lawsuits in general from non-shareholders. So if nothing else, that's a giant distraction for the company and can cost them money. I'm not sure if it can cost them a significant amount of money when they're already burning $330,000 an hour, but it's certainly not something that benefits the company.
Yeah. It seems like it would be very distracting to the employees of the company that are also shareholders as part of their compensation package, because they'd all be multiplying 420 by how many shares they hold, and they'd be like, is this going to happen? I want to hear more news about it.
Yeah. Then they'd be mighty disappointed if it falls apart.
Yeah.
I feel bad for our listeners because, like, I don't have any, like, amazing insight into this. All I can tell you is how much of a clusterfuck it is and, like, how there's just the kind of good information we would need is not there. But as the days go on and that information continues to be absent, it looks worse and worse.
Well, I think that a listener of the podcast would be like, I wonder if Craig has any additional information. And if you don't, that's its own information. Wow, there must not really be anything out there.
Yeah, that is a good data point because I spend way too much time messing with this. So
That's true.
I waste my life aggregating Tesla data for you. So
It's a weird thing. Has anything like this happened before with other companies that you're aware of?
I saw some mention of, I don't want to say it was Herbalife. It was another one of these companies that has been very contentious over the last several years, like Theranos or Herbalife or one of them, where their CEO basically did the same thing, like said that they had a buyout offer at some high amount and it spiked the stock up real high and turned out to be fraud. But I just kind of saw mention that this kind of thing has happened in recent history. I didn't see what the outcome was.
So what's your prediction?
Based on the lack of ability to find anybody willing to say we are helping to fund this, I think it's fake. But again, like I can't get past like why would Elon do that? I just don't see how it benefits him. And I don't want to fall to some lazy explanation like, he took 3 Ambien and 3 fingers of whiskey and then started tweeting. You know? I feel like that's a really lazy explanation and I don't want to do that, but if I feel like it's not for real, I have to try to explain why he made the tweet. And I can't come up with an explanation I like for that either.
Well, it hurts short sellers a lot, right?
Sure.
Especially if their position was coming due right at that moment. Is there some incentive to like scare people from selling Tesla short so that you can then have the stock price be higher at some future date when you need to raise a bunch of debt by selling it or something like that?
I don't know of any way that that would really benefit them. Some people have offered the explanation that it gets the share price up above the conversion price of some of the bonds that are coming due next year, but those bonds aren't due for like 7 months from now. So I feel like starting this whole ruse this early, like the whole thing could play out and the share price could just crash down if, say, Elon's getting sued by a bunch of people and then the SEC is investigating and it turns out there was no buyout anyway. And then, maybe Q3 and Q4 are not profitable, or maybe they're not profitable enough for people to think that it's really convincing. There's still a lot of time for events that could get that share price back down below the conversion price for those bonds. So I'm unconvinced by that explanation that he did it to pump the share price up to cover those bonds.
Yeah, but that's assuming that no further manipulation occurs. But like this is a system that has Elon in it as a component. And so now if you're an investor considering short selling Tesla and you know that he's willing to do this, then it says selling them short is even more of a risk than it would be for an ordinary company.
Yeah, that's a very good insight.
So you're going to have 3 more quarterly results from like now to next year, but then you never know if he might take another criminal stock manipulation action after each of like the quarterly results and keep the stock price pumped.
Yeah. It's better than anything I can come up with.
Yeah, it's my best guess. It sounds a little conspiracy theory, although it only takes one person because
Yeah.
of the amplification effect of Twitter.
Yeah, so I was sufficiently spooked. I sold out of my position Wednesday morning. I'm up quite a bit. I've made about $5,500 profit betting against them, but I don't have a position right now because Tuesday night I felt like there was just not enough information to know if this was real and they were going to seal the deal later this week or if this is fake. And I was able to close my position at a good profit. So I went ahead and did that. What I'm planning to do right now is not have a position against the company for a while, wait for the Q3 results to be released sometime in early November, and then the 2021 puts will come on sale, I believe, the second week of November. So what I'm hoping is that Tesla pulls out all the stop, uses all their one-time tricks, and shows a profit for Q3. The stock goes way up, and when those puts come out, I can buy them cheap and resume betting against Tesla.
I just read that tweet and thought, no way is this real, and I didn't sell anything.
Yeah, and you saw what I was saying in your Discord channel on Tuesday that, man, this doesn't make sense. Like, who would pay $70 billion for a company with $25 billion of liabilities?
Well, also, who announces it in this fashion?
I can believe that with Elon. That's fine.
Hmm.
I don't think that's a big deal. I mean, you look at how many tweets Elon sends a day, how many tweets like Donald Trump says a day. How many like big things does Donald Trump announce through tweets? So I don't feel like that's a big data point.
I guess I don't know for Trump. I feel like he says a lot of things on Twitter, but I don't know how many are big things being announced versus stuff where nothing ever actually comes of it.
Oh, right. Like, I think the quality of the average tweet is pretty low, but occasionally he does do things like announce that he's meeting with Kim Jong Un over Twitter.
Hmm.
So sometimes there is like the diamond in the rough of here's the really big important thing, and it's being announced on Twitter because that's a thing people do now. People in positions of power. And so Elon doing it doesn't really like strike me as weird.
Okay.
But yeah, I decided to sell too soon, secure the profit, and get out for a while to see what the heck happens with all of this. If Elon's goal was to shake out the weak hands, he succeeded on me.
That's true. The way I think of it is there's something that you can point to later and say, look at what a prophet I was.
Or what an idiot.
Or what an idiot. Although I think you've already successfully predicted a bunch of things from one podcast to another. So at the very least, you have some track record.
Maybe so.
You'll only look like a partial idiot, not a total idiot.
Then I can say I learned from my mistakes and I can look even better.
There you go.
Come talk to us on our subreddit. Tell us why we're wrong. We'd really like to know. If you disagree with this and you have like good arguments and not just like trolling shit posting, then come tell us. Seriously, there was a guy who came on after the last Tesla podcast and he's a Tesla bull. And, you know, we exchanged several messages back and forth and he was a pleasure to talk to because he seemed very well informed.
Yeah, that guy was great.
Yeah, we'd like more people like that, especially if you're a Tesla bull. Like, if you're a Tesla bull and you read through all of the income statements and the 10Qs and everything, and you really understand the finances of the company and you're still a Tesla bull, I'd really love to talk to you.
And make sure to donate to us on Patreon.
Yeah, do that too.